Good afternoon. This is afternoon where I am in a cold and windy Potchefstroom. And I'd like to present some of the work that I did with my PhD supervisor, Professor Hennie Kruger. And I will be talking on information security behavioral threshold analysis in practice, and specifically a framework that we developed for the implementation of this approach in practice. Now, first off, before I start with the content, just an overview of what you can expect during the talk. First, an introduction and contextualization of where does this work fit in, what is the eventual goal that we have with the work that we did. Then I will look at a qualitative framework evaluation strategies. There are two of them called ECF and STOPE. And these are strategies that you can use to test how well does your framework do what you expect it to do. And then also looking at a combination of those two evaluation strategies. And then we'll have a look at the underlying model, the theory that our work is based on. We are going to look at the proposed framework, what it is that we are eventually proposing for the application of behavioral threshold analysis. We'll look at an evaluation that we did on the framework using these evaluation strategies, a summary of the contributions that we made with this work, and of course, ending off with a conclusion. Now, first off, just a bit of an introduction and the contextualization. For this audience, this is nothing new, but the human factor in information security is, of course, relevant throughout literature. This is why, of course, why we are all here. This is what we are working on, and this is often researched under themes such as the human aspect of information security, also awareness, culture. We sometimes see the privacy paradox popping up, and this, of course, is relevant because the human factor is difficult to manage, and this is because humans are unpredictable in nature. They behave unpredictably, and interestingly, they also behave in a contradictory manner to what you would expect them to behave. And of course, this makes everything difficult to understand. And if you can't understand something, it's difficult to manage. And this is why we see a lot of focus on the human factor of information security. Now, how do we evaluate information security behavior? If we want to evaluate behavior, we first need to understand the internal motivation that a person has for performing a certain behavior. What are their thought processes? What's effectively going on in your mind before you act on a certain behavior? And in order to do this, many studies employ psychological theories or models. You might have noticed some of these before. Specifically, they are the theory of reasoned action, knowledge, attitude, and behavior, the theory of planned behavior, protection motivation theory. So there are many of these that we see quite often in literature, and there are many more that are also used to try and understand how behavior is formed and how do you eventually influence behavior if it's in terms of information security, because you want positive information security behavior. And this, of course, then is used as the basis for many of these information security behavior studies. But these approaches do have their limitations. All of these models and theories that I've mentioned just now focuses on the individual. It asks the question, how does the individual form behavioral patterns? What informs behavior of the individual? And the question that we're asking is now, what happens when it's no longer an individual, but if we have people in groups? How does that influence behavior, and what does that contribute to the way in which behavior is formed? And this is also relevant in recent literature, and it's beginning to receive attention in literature. And in order to do this, we need new approaches and methods that are sensitive to this group cognition, that need to take into account how does the group dynamic influence behavior in the individual, and also how does the individual on his turn influence the group in its behavior. Now, this research that we're reporting on now is the culmination of a bigger research project that we've been working on since, I think, 2016. And we've been writing a series of papers on behavioral threshold analysis, specifically in the context of information security. And this is, and I had to go count them this morning. This is the 12th paper in the series. And hopefully this is our last contribution on this specific topic. And in this contribution, we propose a framework for implementing and evaluating information security group behavior, it was specifically based on this behavioral threshold analysis. And as far as we're aware, there aren't any other available frameworks in literature. We weren't able to find any others that specifically relate to group behavior. And we constructed this framework by drawing on the experiences of all of these past papers that we've written, all of the work that's gone into the previous work to construct this framework, and eventually to answer the question, is this proposed framework fit for what we intend to use it for? So the idea is we want to implement behavioral threshold analysis in practice. How should you do this? And is the framework that we propose for this, is it well suited for the process? Now, if we want to know whether the framework is well suited, we need to first be able to evaluate whether the framework is actually something worthwhile. And we came across two evaluation strategies. The first one called evidence, context, and facilitation, or ECF. And this has been used in literature for evaluating frameworks in other fields, not necessarily relating to information security. I think this is the first application in information security. But then also drawing on information security literature, there's an approach called STOPE, or Strategy, Technology, Organization, People, and Evidence. And it's specifically been used to evaluate frameworks that relate to information security culture. And as we had a look at these two evaluation strategies, we decided, well, why not combine the two, because they have shared similarities, and it might help us to better identify whether our framework is fit for the purpose that we are trying to use it for. And so now I'm going to take a quick look at each of these strategies. So the first one, ECF, those three criteria, as they are called in relation to ECF. Evidence refers to how much scrutiny has your framework undergone. Are you really sure that the underlying theories that you are basing your framework on are suited for your purpose? And what substantiation is there for this? What proof effectively do you have to say that your underlying theories work well? Then there's the context part, which is concerned with the setting in which your framework is to be applied. And it usually relates to physical attributes of the environment, such as buildings, people, and processes. But in terms of behavior, we can also see that this implicitly refers to intangible qualities, such as individual and group behavior with relation to information security, and also the underlying security culture within an organization. This all forms part of the context in which the framework is to be applied. And finally, the facilitation refers to, if you are implementing your framework, your ultimate goal is to effect some sort of change. In our context, it's to inform on better information security behavior, specifically in groups. And in order to effect change, we need to understand and alter attitudes and behaviors of the individuals and the group to provide for better eventual information security within the organization. And along with these three factors, the eventual success of your implementation can be seen as a function of these three criteria. And of course, this depends on the level of maturity that you have reached in your framework for each of these criteria. So it eventually says that your implementation of your framework can only be successful if you have reached a high enough level of maturity in your framework. Then the second evaluation strategy, STOPE, that refers to strategy, which in turn again refers to the suggested measures that are applied to effect change. And these measures are of course based on your framework and the structured approach that you provide in your framework. Technology usually refers to the technological means that you use to safeguard information. Let's say, for instance, are your firewalls in place? Do you have enough of the technical protection that is available for your organization? But when we relate this back to behavior, the human aspect, this can include the evaluation of information security behavior. Do you have some sort of technical means to assist in this evaluation? Organization, of course, refers to the organizational structure and the organization where you plan to apply your intervention or your framework. And part of the organization is, of course, people. And this framework then seeks to address the human aspect, specifically in terms of behavior, culture, and awareness. And the final one on the STOPE is the environment. This is the greater context in which an organization has to address information security. And this can refer in terms of group behavior to the context in which the individual or the group find themselves. What does the environment look like, and what is the influence thereof on how the individual and eventually the group behaves in terms of information security? Now, we saw that there is quite an overlap between the two, and if we critically look at these two evaluation strategies, we can do a conceptual mapping of the two. We can see that the context and facilitation criteria of the ECF approach can be mapped to the organization, people, and environment, as well as strategy and technology of the STOPE views. And but that leaves us with the idea of evidence. Now, how do we relate evidence in terms of ECF? How do we relate STOPE to that? And of course, this is the result of the STOPE evaluation can be aligned with evidence. And this, of course, is also supported by other means of evidence, such as successful applications of the theories in practice, the theories that underline your framework. And of course, if you publish these findings, have they been accepted by the academic or the scientific community? Have these applications been peer reviewed, and are we all in agreement that this is evidence of a successful application? Now, the underlying model that we are proposing to apply is called the threshold models of collective behavior. And this was developed by Granovetter all the way back in 1978, before I was even born. And this model says that group behavior is determined by the interaction between individuals. In other words, that the individuals influence each other. And specifically, the actions of individuals will help dictate how a single person will act in terms of information security when we relate it back to our application, and also how the combination of individual behaviors relate back to the group behavior. And this method of influence is not something that just happens randomly. The model theorizes that this is based on an intrinsic threshold for participating in the behavior that you see someone else participating in. And it can be expressed as saying that if enough others participate or abstain in a certain behavior, I will also do this. And this model can therefore be theoretically applied to any situation where you have to make a decision between two outcomes. And the examples that are commonly seen is the example of a protest. And I like to use this one for illustrating the working of the model because it is so relevant. If, let's say, for instance, you have a peaceful protest in front of some other government building, what is the tipping point where peaceful protest becomes no longer so? You have one or two instigators that will start damaging property, and the whole thing escalates until a point where almost all of the protesters participate in this behavior of damaging property. And we try to relate this back to information security behavior. And let's say, for instance, how many other people do I need to see practicing bad information security behavior before I will also be influenced to participate in this behavior? And if we want to analyze the behavior of the group, we need to know what these threshold values are. And one thing that we can do to know what these thresholds are is just to ask someone how many people who do need to share their passwords before you will also be sharing your password. And we give them this this percentage of other people sharing their passwords in an interval of 10%. So let's say between 10 and 20% of people share their passwords. Would you also be willing to do this? And if we have these threshold values for all of the individuals in a group, then we can mathematically aggregate those threshold values, and we can make a prediction on what the group behavior will look like eventually in terms of the information security group behavior. So this is the framework that we've proposed, and this all relates to different phases that we went through in this research project. I've just received a 5-minute warning from Malcolm, so I'm going to speed it up a bit. And you're welcome to look at this in the paper as well. And for us to be able to evaluate whether this works well, we used the publications in this series as the evidence of peer review when we relate this to the organization environment with the context in the ECF, and we motivate why this is an example of the framework being fit for the purpose that we want to use this for. And the same we do for facilitation with ECF and the two mapped views, the strategy and the technology. How do we use technology, and how do we strategize for the implementation of the framework? And we also looked at the practical applications that we had with this approach. The two of them specifically that I'd like to highlight was an industry application where we had a look at the group behavior of employees at a utility company, and also the second one, an academic application where we looked at the group behavior of students who live together in a university residence, and look at the commonalities and the differences between these two setups. And we also took this successful application of our approach to indicate that this is indeed a suitable approach for information security group behavior. So what did we contribute through this study? We contributed a methodology for formalizing a framework for the analysis of group behavior. We also synthesized these qualitative measures by combining these two methods that we found in literature. And finally, we contributed by evaluating an approach to measure this information security group behavior and to make predictions on these. And in summary, we constructed this framework that is based on the behavioral threshold analysis as our central theoretical model. we looked at these two qualitative evaluation methods, and we combined these two methods. And at the end, our finding was that yes, indeed, this framework that we developed is indeed fit for the purpose that we intended to use it for. Thanks a lot.